In 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, his friends published a collection of 36 plays that shaped the English language for the next 4 centuries. That book, the first folio, is the source of nearly everything we think we know about him. And according to a new AI-driven linguistic study that has been quietly circulating through academic circles, roughly 40% of the text in that folio may not have been written by the same person as the rest of it. Not a few scenes, not a rewritten speech, entire acts, entire characters, possibly entire plays. The research is controversial. It is also the most detailed attempt yet to pull the author or authors of the most famous body of work in English apart strand by strand. Before we go further, a quick note. No one who runs this research is claiming Shakespeare did not exist. The man from Stratford-upon-Avon was real. He signed documents. He owned property. He went to court over petty disputes like any other Elizabethan businessman. What the AI is probing is something subtler. Whether the person whose name appears on the title pages was the sole author of the works attributed to him, or whether he was the most visible figure in a looser, messier, more collaborative workshop than the heroic lone genius story has ever admitted. The study in question was led by a team of computational linguists working across 3 universities. They trained a model on every surviving piece of Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, around 200 plays, tens of thousands of pages. The model learned the fingerprint of each known author, the rhythms of their sentences, their favorite filler words, the positions they tended to place certain grammatical constructions. Human scholars have tried to do this for a century with statistics. The AI had the advantage of scale. It could weigh hundreds of stylistic markers simultaneously and test them against each other in ways no human could track. When they turned it loose on the Shakespeare corpus, it flagged several patterns that have been whispered about in literature departments for decades. First, the earliest plays in the canon carry stylistic fingerprints that differ meaningfully from the later ones. That is not surprising. Writers grow. But the shifts the AI detected are sharper than a natural development curve would predict. They look, in some places, less like the same writer maturing and more like different writers taking turns. Second, within certain specific plays, the model identified what it called author-boundary transitions. These are spots in the text where the stylistic fingerprint changes abruptly, from one scene to the next, in ways that would be very difficult for a single writer to produce on purpose. The most striking examples turned up in the histories, the late romances, and 1 or 2 of the tragedies that have long been suspected of having had a collaborator. Third, and this is the part that has triggered the most academic argument, the model identified several stylistic patterns that do not correspond to any known Elizabethan writer whose work survives. In other words, the AI found what appear to be the fingerprints of authors who are not in the reference set. That could mean many things. It could mean minor playwrights whose work has been lost. It could mean anonymous collaborators whose contributions have never been documented. Or it could mean that at least one significant writer of the era is missing from history entirely. To understand why this matters, you have to remember how Elizabethan theater actually worked. A play was not a precious literary object. It was a product. Companies needed new material constantly. Writers were hired by the week, by the scene, by the speech. Established dramatists farmed out subplots to younger writers. Popular playwrights were asked to punch up other people's scripts. The line between author and collaborator was fuzzy at best, and often deliberately erased when the finished play was marketed under the name of whichever writer the audience wanted. That is not controversy. That is just how the industry operated. What the AI study suggests is that Shakespeare, like every other major dramatist of his time, may have been far more embedded in that collaborative system than the later cult of the solitary genius has let us see. Some of what the model flagged overlaps with things scholars already suspected. Thomas Middleton, a younger playwright and Shakespeare's colleague, has long been credited with sections of Timon of Athens and Macbeth. George Wilkins has been tied to parts of Pericles. John Fletcher's hand has been seen in The Two Noble Kinsmen and Henry VIII. Traditional scholarship, using careful analysis of vocabulary and meter, arrived at those conclusions slowly and painfully over generations. The AI confirmed many of them in an afternoon, but it did not stop there. It went further. The study argues, with layered caveats, that several plays traditionally held up as pure Shakespearean work may contain substantial material from other hands. It identifies stretches of dialogue in a well-known history play that statistically resemble the fingerprint of a playwright who has never been linked to Shakespeare before. It points to a soliloquy in a late tragedy that sits outside the main stylistic envelope of everything else in that play. In a romance that has always been considered a bit of a structural oddity, the AI flagged what it describes as at least 3 distinct author signatures. If the data holds up, the man most of us picture when we imagine Shakespeare, the quiet Warwickshire businessman with the goatee from the engraving, was probably still the prime mover behind the works that carry his name. He was probably the dominant voice, the senior figure, the orchestrator. But he may have been working with a rotating cast of junior collaborators whose contributions were absorbed, uncredited, into a legend that was built long after his death. It is important to underline how contested this research is. Traditional Shakespeare scholars, some of whom have spent their entire careers attending to every rhythm of every line, are not simply rolling over. One prominent critic argues that the AI is picking up on stylistic variation within a single highly experimental writer, not on the fingerprints of separate authors. Shakespeare, this critic points out, deliberately ventriloquized different voices. A king does not sound like a peasant. A Roman soldier does not sound like an English clown. A mature writer may sound, scene to scene, like several different people, on purpose. If the AI is trained on the average style of other playwrights, it may flag Shakespeare's intentional range as evidence of multiple authors. That is a real concern, and the research team has admitted it. To push back on that concern, the team ran what they call voice-controlled tests. They compared speeches by low-status characters to other speeches by low-status characters, noble to noble, comic to comic. In other words, they tried to isolate the underlying authorial fingerprint from the surface-level ventriloquism. They say the stylistic breaks still appear even when character type is controlled for. If that holds up under peer review, it weakens the alternative explanation considerably. There is another counterargument worth taking seriously. Elizabethan typesetters were not neutral. They routinely silently altered spelling, punctuation, and sometimes even word order to fit the page. The first folio itself was assembled years after the plays were written, from a mixture of theater prompt books, author manuscripts, and printed earlier editions. Each of those sources had been touched by different hands. Some scholars argue that what the AI is detecting might not be different authors at all. It might be different scribes, different compositors, different typesetters leaving faint traces across the text. That is a genuine possibility. The research team is preparing a follow-up that tries to separate authorial fingerprints from compositorial ones. Until that work is done, the multiple author hypothesis has a real alternative sitting next to it. Setting aside the literary detective work, the cultural implications are worth thinking about. For 4 centuries, the idea of Shakespeare as a solitary genius has shaped how we imagine creative greatness. The image of one man sitting alone, scratching out Hamlet by candlelight, has been central to how the Western world talks about artistic achievement. If the AI analysis is broadly correct, the actual picture looks a little different. It looks more like a busy workshop. A head dramatist surrounded by junior writers, revising each other's lines, passing drafts back and forth, producing as a group the material that would later be attributed to a single name for marketing reasons, and then for legend reasons, and then for patriotic reasons. That is not a diminishment of Shakespeare. If anything, it makes the achievement more interesting. Leading a workshop that produces Hamlet and King Lear and The Tempest is not a smaller feat than writing them alone. It is just a different feat. It is less romantic. It is more human. The work also opens up a question that has quietly haunted Shakespeare studies forever. Where are the manuscripts? Almost no writing in Shakespeare's own hand survives. No diaries, no notebooks, no working drafts. A single contested page of a play he may have co-written is the closest thing we have. For a writer of his stature, that absence has always been a strange silence. A plausible reason, if the workshop picture is correct, is that the Shakespeare name on the first folio was partly a brand. The manuscripts, if they ever existed as single-author artifacts, may never have been assembled in that form at all. They may have lived instead as scattered scenes in the hands of different contributors. A deeper question lurks beneath all of this. If the authorship picture is genuinely as collaborative as the I suggests, what does it mean to love Shakespeare? I would argue it does not change very much. The plays are still the plays. The language is still the language. Hamlet still asks the questions Hamlet asks. We do not read King Lear differently because some scenes were tightened by a junior dramatist. We read it for the experience of the words themselves. The authorship debate is interesting precisely because it does not take anything away. It only asks us to look more honestly at how great work actually gets made. None of this is settled. The AI study is a provocation more than a verdict. It will be argued about for years. More models will be trained. More counter-studies will be written. Some of the bolder claims will almost certainly fall apart under careful scrutiny. Others, more likely, will quietly become the new consensus. That is how scholarship works, slowly and with a lot of pushing back. What feels different about this moment is that the tools available to probe the question have become sharper. For the first time, we can ask, with real statistical precision, whether the text of the world's most famous plays carries the fingerprints of one writer or of many. The early answer, imperfect and heavily qualified, appears to be many. If that holds, the story of how the English language's greatest work was actually produced is going to get richer, stranger, and more collaborative than the solitary genius tale ever allowed. The man from Stratford may have been the captain of that ship. He was almost certainly not its only crew. There's another layer of this story worth spending a moment on, because it gets at something people tend to underestimate about Elizabethan culture. The world Shakespeare lived in did not share our modern obsession with authorial singularity. The idea that a work of art is the unique emanation of a single mind is, in historical terms, a relatively recent invention. It hardened into orthodoxy in the 18th and 19th centuries, in the wake of romantic ideas about the lone genius and copyright law that needed a single name on a contract. Before that, literature had always been a more tangled affair. Chaucer borrowed freely. Medieval playwrights built on each other's work without credit. Biblical texts themselves are, by modern standards, radically collaborative. What the AI may be doing is not overturning our picture of Shakespeare. It may simply be returning him to the messy, communal, creative culture he actually lived in, a culture we have been projecting modern assumptions back onto for 200 years. That reframing has consequences for how we read the plays themselves. Once you accept that a given scene might have been drafted by a junior dramatist under senior guidance, certain oddities in the text start to make sense. The strange tonal shifts in some of the late romances, the unevenness of certain history plays, the moments where a character's voice seems to drift, almost mid-scene, into something a little different. Scholars have tried to explain those moments as deliberate stylistic choices. Some of them may have been, but some of them may simply have been seams, the places where one writer's contribution met another's, and the final hand responsible for cleaning up the play either did not notice or did not care. It is also worth asking what the AI cannot do. These models, powerful as they are, do not have intuition. They cannot tell you why a line of poetry is beautiful, or why a particular image lands harder than the line before it. They measure patterns. They count words. They trace rhythms. The actual question of artistic greatness lives in a place the models cannot yet reach. So when we talk about Shakespeare's genius, we are talking about something the AI is not pretending to analyze. The authorship question is about who put certain words on the page. The question of greatness is about why those words still move us 4 centuries later. The two questions overlap, but they are not the same, and conflating them has caused a fair bit of confusion in the public discussion of this research. A fair-minded view of the evidence at this point looks something like this. The traditional picture of Shakespeare as a single author working mostly alone has always had cracks in it. Scholars have known about collaborators for a long time. The AI is sharpening our view of where those cracks are, and it is suggesting that they may be wider and more numerous than most of us realized. The radical view that the author we call Shakespeare was a group identity from the start still has more weight of tradition against it than evidence for it. But the moderate view that Shakespeare was a dominant creative figure at the center of a genuinely collaborative workshop is now supported by more data than ever. That is probably where the consensus is heading, if it settles anywhere soon. Finally, there is something about this conversation that feels oddly contemporary. In our own era, the question of who wrote what has been complicated again, this time by AI tools that can produce convincing text in seconds. Modern readers are having to wrestle, for the first time in generations, with questions about authorship, originality, and collaboration that were old news in Shakespeare's day. Perhaps there is a quiet lesson in that. The heroic solitary writer was always a partial fiction. Writers have always worked in networks and traditions and conversations with other minds. The tools have changed. The underlying truth has not. What looks like genius, up close, usually turns out to be a community of hands working together, with one of them holding the pen at the end. If the Shakespeare we inherit from this new wave of research is a slightly different figure, less alone, more embedded, more human, he may actually become easier to see clearly. The marble statue of the solitary bard has always been a little cold. The picture of a working writer at the center of a crowded theater, a man who drew on everyone around him and made their contributions sing, feels closer to the kind of creativity the plays themselves celebrate. It is, in some sense, the most Shakespearean ending the authorship question could have. A story that turns out to be full of voices. A truth that is richer because it is shared. Whatever the next wave of study shows, this moment feels like a turning point. The tools we now have for reading old texts are sharper than anything previous generations of scholars ever dreamed of. The questions they are raising are uncomfortable, but they are the right questions. And the conversations those questions are starting, in classrooms and seminars and quiet corners of the internet, are going to shape how we think about literary greatness for the rest of the century. It is, in the end, a good time to be reading Shakespeare and to be curious about who exactly was writing him. One practical consequence of all this, worth keeping in mind, is that the way we edit and publish the plays may slowly begin to change. For centuries, editors have presented the first folio texts as though they were pristine emanations of a single mind. Footnotes might occasionally acknowledge a likely collaborator, but the overall packaging has always treated the plays as the work of one author. Future editions, informed by the new computational evidence, may take a more honest approach. Sections credibly attributable to other hands could be marked as such, not to diminish the work, but to restore a fuller picture of how the plays came together. Some readers will find that distracting. Others will find it fascinating. Either way, it would be more truthful than the version we have been handed for generations. There is also a professional side of this story that deserves a mention. For many English departments, the idea of a collaborative Shakespeare has long been politically awkward. Careers have been built on the assumption of a solitary author. Entire theoretical frameworks about artistic vision and individual genius rest on that assumption. The new data does not destroy those frameworks. It just complicates them. And in any academic field, complications have a way of being slow to accept. Some scholars will welcome the work. Others will resist it. The resolution, as in most things, will happen not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow turnover of generations, as students who grew up with these tools take their place at the front of the classroom. For the rest of us, the lesson is probably a gentler one. The great works of the past were produced by people. People have always been surrounded by other people. And the art we inherit is, almost always, a team effort disguised, for practical reasons, behind a single famous name. Shakespeare, it turns out, may be the biggest example of that simple truth we have, which makes him, if anything, more interesting, not less.